Hello and welcome to the San Antonio Book Festival. My name is Zinnia Bayardo. I am a high school librarian in San Antonio, Texas, and I want to welcome and enthusiastically say hello to our two amazing authors, Brittney Morris, and let me just read the bio here, is the author of Slay, the newly released The Cost of Knowing, and Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales Wings of Fury. And for all of my gamers out there, she is also written for video games, pretty amazing. And she is a new mommy, has an economics degree, and is coming to us from her home in Philly. Philly, yes?
Yep.
Welcome. And also Natalia Sylvester, born in Lima, Peru. Natalia Sylvester comes to the US at the age of 4, grew up in Florida and the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. She has a BA in creative writing, works as a freelance writer in Texas. Natalia is the author of Chasing the Sun, Everyone Knows You Go Home, one of my faves. And now she has this YA novel running. Yay, okay, awesome. So welcome, both of you. Welcome to San Antonio virtually.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, good to be here.
All right, so for those of us who haven't read the book Running or The Cost of Not Knowing, can you just give us a quick synopsis of the book really quick?
Yeah, so I can go first. The Cost of Knowing is about two brothers, Alex and Isaiah. They are Black. The older one, Alex, can see into the future, and the younger one, Isaiah, can see into the past. And everything changes when the older brother sees a vision of his younger brother dying in the next couple of days. And so it becomes a race against time to get to the bottom of a 400-year-old family curse. And between living with anxiety about the future and intergenerational trauma from the past, they have to figure out what it means to be a joyful Black boy in the present. So I put a lot of work into it. It came out 2 days ago. 3, nope, 4. What is time anymore? And I'm super excited to share it with everyone.
That's so awesome. Congratulations, Brittney.
Thanks.
So Running is about a 15-year-old girl named Maddie, who's Cuban American, and her father is a senator of Florida who's running for president. And she's really always been someone who supports her father but doesn't really understand a lot about his political beliefs. And when the campaign really puts her in the national spotlight, she starts to become more aware of what her own beliefs are and how they actually don't align with her father's. And so she has to make a choice and has to decide whether she'll speak up for what she believes in this very public way, or if she'll stand behind him and support him in the ways that she always has, but then in a way actually be silent about her beliefs. So that's Running.
So the title of this session is Finding Your Voice, right? And so let's start with the real, kind of tough conversations. I was once in a session about literature and leadership, and the author in that session was asked about tough topics in lit and how it can either be uncomfortable for or taboo or maybe just not allowed by the adult or an adult in charge, like for teachers, for educators. And so sometimes they don't touch on those, politics or current events or life. So sometimes it can be uncomfortable for them. And the author in that session responded with this quote that has stuck with me ever since. When teens turn 18, we expect them to solve the problems of the world. How can they fix that if they've never seen the problems, or if they've never had tough conversations about the problems or debates about the problems? Why do you think adults are so uncomfortable with tough topics with kids? And what advice do you give those parents, educators that don't really want to or are timid to have those conversations?
It seems like that can stem from a desire to kind of preserve the child, kids, and they'll be their own or people in their family. And unfortunately, there are so many things about this world that take away their childhood early anyway. A big theme in The Cost of Knowing is the childhoods of young Black men and how they're often forced to grow up too early just by living in a world that sees them as adults far earlier than they actually are, than they actually become adults. And I think teens especially deserve to be able to read books about wherever they are, and deal with issues that they're facing now in school. And that can be, you know, sex, it can be drugs, it can be whatever. They're encountering these things. Living in denial about it isn't helping anyone. And I think it's better to tackle these issues head on and put them in books so that teens can see real other examples of kids going through this and know that they're not alone.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's interesting from that quote you mentioned, Zinnia, that they mentioned the age 18, because I think too often we do talk about this as if suddenly when a person is of voting age, that suddenly means that their voice matters, or that their, you know, that their actions matter. And I think that's such a really narrow way of looking at it, because first of all, not every teenager, not every person has the right to vote. For whatever reason, whether it be their documentation status, whether depending on the state they're in, whether they're they were formerly incarcerated and they don't, you know, they haven't had those rights restored. And it's just another way of telling people that their power is only through this one way, right? That has throughout history actively been suppressed, mostly to communities of color. So I think that if anything, we have to remind teens and young people that their power is not just expressed through a vote; it's through their voice, and to tell them that they have to be older enough to exercise that power is a complete disservice to them, you know. And they're living through these things every day. They're observing the ways that politics and you know, all our entire society affects their lives. If they aren't aware of it, they might be privileged enough to not have to be aware of it because it's working in their favor. So I think that I would tell any adults that's hesitant about that to question why and who that really serves, because it usually just serves the interests of certain people and not others. And it's interesting to me because when we look at like the arc of history and we like to say like, oh, you know, there was all these horrible things that happened in the past, and you know, we'll often say like, oh, but people didn't know better back then, right? That's one of the things we say. But then if we look across history, who was always leading change? It's always been young activists, and mostly young activists of color, right? So it's like these are the people we should be listening to. We shouldn't be afraid to make sure that their voices are heard and empowered by us.
I'm so glad that you said that, because the quote in well, first of all, what you just said about, you know, just through the vote, I almost feel like we think that kids, it's like rainbows, unicorns, and sunshine between the ages of birth and 17. And then all of a sudden in 18, we're dealing with, you know, the tough topics and the policy making of the world. That's a big span of life happening, and things are happening. And so through your lit and the books that you create, and we could have those conversations, right? So why not use it as a tool to have those, what could be a tough conversation, but really should just be a conversation. But your quote in Running that says, they didn't want to shield me from politics any more than they want to shield me from the air. They just wanted me not to notice that I was breathing. That quote really hit me. I'm a mother of a tween and a teen. I'm a former, very opinionated teenager myself a long time ago. And so I remember, like, you know, our family saying, you know, calladita se ve mejor, mijita. Right?
Yeah,
a quiet little girl looks a lot better.
Yeah.
So those comments when I was younger would check me, and I would feel like, oh, I'm being disrespectful. I'm not following the rules. I'm not being compliant. I'm upsetting my elders. But as an adult, that quote gets me riled up, right? So your quote right there really was so perfect. Do you want to speak more on that?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that a lot. And I relate a lot because, you know, one of the things that I wanted to touch upon with running, and specifically with Maddie, and that it's not just about speaking up, like the fear of speaking up. It's also with her, it's layered because it's speaking up against your father, and it's not just layered in this gendered way, but in also a very cultural way. Especially because of that quote that you just said, you know, caída te eres más bonita, and it's always this very this machismo mixed in there with this expectation of what it means to be a good daughter in a Latinx family, and it is usually just this quiet acceptance and support of the male figures in the family. And so she's not just, you know, battling this idea of, you know, is my voice important enough to be heard, or should I speak up and what will people think? But it's really like, am I going to go against everything that I've been raised to believe as a dutiful daughter? And I think that it's something that I wanted to acknowledge, that it's not always that simple, that there's always just layers working at it. And I think that's just the way that marginalization and silencing and oppression works too. You know, and you know, just because you know, her father is obviously Latinx, you know, and he's Cuban American and he's Latinx, he's also a white Latinx man. So he has a lot of privilege that exists, but even within her own family, that exists at different levels, because the women in her family are not as light-skinned as he is. And so he walks through the world differently, also as a man and as a white man. And so there's just all these layers of privilege and oppression that I was hoping to explore, and just to show that it's not always that simple. But I do think it is important to be aware of those things as we when we start advocating and when we start you know, trying to push against those things.
Yeah, Brittney, do you want to share anything about, you know, teen activists and either our hesitance as adults to encourage that? I once have heard a administrator say, "Oh, we don't want to create activists," as if that was a bad thing. So is our hesitance either for adults to have that, or there's a good question from one of our viewers, Nikki Polk. She wants to know, where would you tell younger teens, 12, 13 years old, to focus their power?
That's a fantastic question. I'm going to start by talking about the hesitancy in adults to foster activism in teens. As another formerly extremely opinionated teenager, once upon a time, I was in a position to be, you know, questioning adults and their behavior and break down structures that I had always taken for granted and things that I thought were the norm and were expected. And I mean, as young people, that's what you're supposed to do. Every generation does that. It's the normal, it's part of the circle of life. And I feel like fostering that and encouraging that, even when it's uncomfortable for us, and, you know, teenagers are constantly raising new concepts all the time and starting whole new industries and everything, and just, you know, rolling with the punches is the best way to, like, let the earth change around us and let society evolve. I feel like young people are the best arbiters of that, and the best thing we can do is just encourage them in what they're doing, and you know, offer our experiences with what we've seen, but at the same time, let them figure it out. And that's not always easy, but I feel like that should be the goal. At least it's the goal in my mind. And as for telling younger teens, 12 and 13 years old, to focus their power, I feel like at 12 or 13, what I wish I would have done at 12 and 13 was really try to figure out who I am, and, like, you know, start interrogating that and figure out, what do I think about the world around me, and how do I see my circumstances, and who the world wants me to be, and what genuinely makes me happy, and beyond just, you know, what I want to be when I grow up, and really just finding my identity for myself. And that's not always an easy process or even a fun process, but I think it's super, super important. And if you see something you don't like, you know, have the freedom to speak up about it. Talk to people close to you that you can trust and that you love, and and surround yourself with people who foster your journey of self-discovery.
Yeah, and don't you think that literature, YA literature specifically, is what can help young adults either figure out where their power lies and how to focus that power to, activism or just create change in their community, their world around them. It's
Absolutely.
that YA is what can help you once you're reading it, discussing it with friends and family, then you can start figuring out who you are in your community and what role you play, right?
Absolutely.
Your quote in Running, Natalia, that said, Papi always says to create change, you need three things: people, purpose, and ganas, which is want, or, the get up and go, the want. And that reminded me a lot of my father. Grandpa lives upstairs here. And he was very much a very activist-minded kind of parent. He wanted his kids to know the truth that wasn't being taught in public school. And so that reminded me of him. And I thought, gosh, I wish there was more like that to help encourage our kids, be those young adult thinkers of their community and how they can help and make better and create change. Is that something that you were raised with yourself?
Yeah, I mean, my parents always encouraged me to just be very independent, to be fearless, and I think that paired with friends, even art took such a huge and created such a huge influence on me in my own personal politics, things I became passionate about, and I think that was one of the things I wanted to touch upon in Running, is that a young person's political and even the personal views, they're often shaped by family, but it's not the only force. And in Mari's case, it's definitely not. Her dad gives her that advice, probably thinking that she's going to go in one direction with it, and she doesn't. And so many of the places actually in the book where she draws strength so much from the things he's taught her, just probably not in the way he ever expected, right? But I think it's important to realize that our circles and the people we learn from are so much bigger than we think, and that we should be okay with opening them up, and even anyone who's starting out in that journey, that it's okay if you don't know all the answers right away. You just need good questions, right? And that follow your questions and be okay with being someone who's just learning, starting out, and be okay with finding people who've been doing the work, and seeing how can you support them, and then you'll find also that activism exists and takes so many different forms, and you'll find the one that maybe best suits you and your passions and your own purposes. Because I think that when we think of activism, we usually have one idea of oh, is it is it marching? Is it organizing? Is it art? It could be all of those things. You just have to find the one that you'll be able to give yourself to in a way that feels right. And that way you'll do the best you can at it by doing the part, being most true to that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Let's talk about the genres. Definitely speaks to the cost of knowing, Brittney, but I love how sometimes fantasy fiction, sci-fi fiction, dystopian, I love how they can creatively, magical realism is my favorite, they can creatively still include critical social issues of today, right? So my favorite one that comes to mind is Children of Blood and Bone. At the end, I was like, wait a minute, I thought I was reading this and she included this. It was awesome. So that, ever since reading that, I thought, wow, this is a great way to help those that are struggle with facing reality of what our true American history is, or facing reality of what the world still is, right? I feel like that fantasy fiction is a great tool to help us have those discussions and help us kind of face this is still around, right? So did you purposely think of that when you were writing the cost?
I think whenever I'm writing any of my books, I think about, taking a concept that maybe my readers are already familiar with and changing it slightly, changing the perspective, changing the scope of it. So with the cost of knowing, a big theme in it is mental health awareness, and specifically for young Black men, but Black people in general as well. Anxiety and depression are often concepts that are misunderstood or attributed to, a lack of positivity or a lack of religion or a lack of something. And it can look different for everybody. And so I took the concept of anxiety and depression and mental health in general and amplified it to a point where hopefully for readers it's unignorable, and it makes the situation for Alex and Isaiah a little bit more clear. So literally being able to see the future and literally being able to see the past and being constantly bombarded by these visions and not being able to ignore them in their lives, that's often what anxiety can feel like, and like dealing with intergenerational trauma. It can often be that real and that debilitating, and that much of a burden to live with. In addition, I really like books that do that anyway. So I was also blown away by Children of Blood and Bone. So like I did that with Slay a little bit, where I took this idea of an all Black space and I said, what if we made it into a VR world and just made it as big as possible? So yeah, that's kind of my roundabout answer to that.
So one of my when I was reading when I first saw the synopsis of the book, I was like, wow, what space was she in, or what was she thinking about when she thought of this concept? Can you share? Like, what was the inspiration?
The concept for the cost of knowing started in a really weird place. Oftentimes my books will start with a question. So with Slay, it was what would happen if there was an all Black video game. And then that, morphed into who would have a problem with an all Black video game. And that ended up having a 65,000 word answer. So with the cost of knowing, it started with a character. I had no idea what his name was, but I knew he worked in a toothpaste factory. And the idea was he would like move toothpaste down the line, and every time he touched a tube of toothpaste, he would see where it would end up and like what the future of it was. And at first it starts out as this weird satirical concept, and then the idea was that it would get kind of deep and kind of sad. And that was just kind of the idea. And I said, okay, that in itself isn't a book. How do I make this a book? So then I thought, what if another character could see into the past? And then I realized if both of these characters are Black, that's kind of already our experience, having to constantly look into the future and constantly look into the past. And once that clicked, I was like, now this is a book. So that was kind of where the story grew from. And then making them brothers, talking about Black masculinity, talking about what their dad has contributed to their concepts of masculinity in multiple generations before him. It all just kind of wove itself together, and all I really had to do was sit and listen, really.
All right, so did y'all hear that? Aspiring authors, writers, your wonderings of the world, your questions throughout the day can turn into a pretty amazing novel. So that's pretty cool. So speaking of the book, the title, when I learned of his brother's ability to see the past, right, and I thought, oh, well, that title hits a little bit different now. So, and it of course reminded me of, that quote, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it, kind of a thing. And so then it made me think, it made me think of how so many people fight hard against acknowledging, accepting what truly is our U.S. history, right? And thinking, well, no, we had a Black president. There's no more racism, right? So the title, The Cost of Knowing, at the end, I thought, oh, there's so much to that title now. There's this, and then there's this. So can you talk a little bit more why you picked that?
Yeah, so the title actually started out The Curse of Knowledge. which is the name of a cognitive bias that happens when an expert in a field struggles to explain the topic at hand to a novice because they're such an expert. And as I just stumbled upon that definition one day, and I realized how difficult it is to explain and get white people to understand why, for example, I'm terrified of the cops, even though I don't have so much as a parking ticket on my record, because I've lived it. And it's very difficult to explain that unless you've lived it. So, or very difficult to understand that unless you've lived it, rather. So that was where the title started. As my editor and I were talking about it, we were editing the book, and she said, you know what, I feel like there's a title out there that would, you know, kind of bring in more of the book, because the book isn't just about that, it's about so much more. And we, you know, went back and forth quite a bit, and we're brainstorming, and the cost of knowing came up at some point in the discussion. So, you know, it can refer to the price that's attached to giving up so much when you're thinking about the future and the past. You know, you're not living in the moment. You're giving up so much of your peace when that happens. And then also just knowing where you came from and knowing what your future could be given the country that you live in and the racial environment that's there. It's got so many different definitions. I'm trying to think of any more that won't spoil the book, but
yeah, I know. I don't want to give it away, but because I read, I'm like, wait, let's talk. But yes, that's why everybody has to go run out and read that now. But yeah, I kept thinking the last few pages of the book as I was reading, I kept thinking, oh, the privilege of not knowing, the privilege of not knowing and carrying that, the privilege of a mother not knowing when my kids go out and not having to have those conversations with them of what to do, the privilege of not knowing of those things. So such a privilege. Speaking of not knowing, Natalia, I love that you shared Mariana's vulnerability. I love that you shared and made her, although my team feels like she knows it all. I love that Mariana doesn't know it all, right? She doesn't know the answers. She doesn't even really know where her father's political position is until she realizes, right? Until it's hit her in her face. So I love that not knowing, because it kind of sends a message to our young readers that it's okay. It's okay to not know. It's okay to not have all the answers and to learn and to grow. That's part of life, right? So can you share more about making that choice that she doesn't know it all in her vulnerability?
Yeah, thank you. I think it was important for me because, you know, when I was writing her, it would have been very easy for me to write her exactly as I wanted her to be, you know, as like, here's this perfect activist who I can agree with 100%. But I realized, like, I don't know that I was ever that person. I'm not sure that any of us are. So many of us already, we live in, it's embedded in us. Like, it's like we live in a racist society. We live in an ableist society. We live in a country founded on the principles of white supremacy. And so a lot of these things are internalized, and until we don't even know to question them, we can't unpack and dismantle them. So part of the journey is to then first just start out realizing it, to see it. You know, like once you see it, hopefully you can't unsee it. And I wanted to kind of show that journey for Mari, because I think it was important to show that not all of us come to this fully aware of everything. What matters is what happens when you are confronted. Like, are you going to get defensive and double down, or are you going to be open to understanding, hey, this isn't actually what I want to put into the world, and how can I change it? And understanding that changing it requires then that vulnerability, you know, and asking tough questions, and being open to learning from others who are further along in that journey. So yeah, I just, you know, that's why her friends were so important to me, because they're people who help her through those really hard parts. And even in a strange way, she ends up helping people in her life. Like, you know, her mom is someone who ends up changing thanks to Mari's transformation. And I think that it's important to show the ways that that even when we are vulnerable and we're open, then we can still help others achieve that as well, right? And kind of, you know, we talk so much about this conversation around how, you know, when we talk about racism, when we talk about different forms of privilege, when we talk about you know, homophobia or, you know, any sort of bigotry, we talk about it like, oh, it's going to be this really uncomfortable conversation. But I feel like that, again, only centers then saying, what you're saying is the default is you're assuming that it's someone who has never had to experience that marginalization. And so you're centering this very privileged group of people and centering their feelings and saying it's going to be uncomfortable for you, but it's okay, right? But in that way, it makes it so that those of us who are wanting to have that conversation are the ones who are making it uncomfortable. And it places us in this position to always be seen as the angry ones who are, you know, attacking, right? And I think we need to push against that. I think we need to be able to say, it's not about whether or not it's comfortable. It's about whose comfort really matters. You know, who's been suffering all this time, who's been hurting all this time. And if it is uncomfortable, then, you know, are we willing to say, yeah, but my discomfort at this one conversation can't possibly be as bad as these generations of not just discomfort, but like true harm and violence.
Yeah, and I think that the way you wrote her really is a lot more realistic than having to have, you know, created a perfect teen that has all the answers. Our kids, I mean, they don't have all the answers, which is why they seek out reading stories where they can see themselves and maybe find, you know, some kind of answers or solutions or something that they can relate to. So the way you wrote her, I think, was a lot more realistic than that. So
thank you.
Let's talk about Texas. Because yeehaw, y'all. I know you're going to be leaving us here in Texas and you're going back home to Miami. But as we all know, in the world of politics, Texas is considered a red state, although it used to be blue at one time and we almost flipped it. But I feel like it makes me think that Texas politics and the whole, you know, political fight in Texas makes for a great book. Did you ever consider running set here in Texas?
You know, no, but mainly because the spark for running was I was watching the elections in 2016, and I saw a speech by a senator whose daughter was standing behind them, and I just kept wondering what was going through her mind and what, you know, she looked really conflicted, you know, and I got really kind of caught up in this idea and this question, kind of like Brittney, you were saying, there's always a question that starts a story, and for me, it was like, what would it be like to be the daughter of someone who is out there so publicly, and you realize you don't actually have the same beliefs as them. And that really right away took me to Florida just because of who this person was. And, you know, me having grown up in Florida and having grown up in Miami, I was really interested in exploring the ways that that within the Latinx population, like we get spoken about as if we can be counted on for this one vote, right? This one political view. And then anytime we deviate from that, as we've seen in past elections, everyone's shocked, except for those within the Latinx population who who have seen this play out even within our own families, that we are an ethnic group made up of many races, many political beliefs, many religious beliefs, you know, just as much needing to be held accountable for our own racism, our own homophobia, our own anti-Blackness, our own, you know, the different levels of privilege that we have based on our immigration status and our wealth. And I don't think we talk enough about that. And when we talk about representation, it always feels like all we want, like, people think that representation should only be like, look how beautiful we are and look how great, you know, we are. But I don't want to just see that. I want to see, like, can we also look at all the different complexities that we hold within ourselves. And some of that's going to be ugly, you know? And so for me, that was something that I grew up around a lot in Miami, and it felt more natural to write the story there. But
Well,
I do still write.
Speaking of that, I really love that you wrote the good, the bad, and the ugly about nuestra gente, because there, like you just said, there's good. We're not perfect, right? And we come from an array of backgrounds that when I heard people tell me, oh my gosh, I can't, and especially in the 2020 election, I can't believe they voted that way. And I thought, you don't know our gente. You don't know. And so I would recently read this book called Finding Latinx by Paola Ramos. So I'm like, everyone should read this. If you had a question, everyone should read this book. But and then also during this election, when I read Running, I thought, oh man, I wonder if there are a lot. And my question to you is, did you think of this? A lot of people who had come to terms during this 2020 elections realizing a lot of our friends and family did vote a certain way that we had to come to terms with and had to accept. And it was difficult, right? And some people didn't survive that. Their relationship didn't survive. And some people grapple with it every day, though we still see each other or whatever. Did you think of that, specifically the reality that is, especially this 2020 election?
Yeah, and I mean, I definitely thought of it. You know, I think that, like in Maddie's case, she grapples with that too, but in the end, it doesn't, like, I hope it doesn't stop us from using our voices. You know, like there does come a time when you realize I might not change someone's mind, nothing. But is that going to stop you from doing what you know is right, what you hope to change in the world? And maybe your activism doesn't have to focus on only one person.
Or maybe it doesn't, you know, yes, the intent is to help change minds, right? Or to help provide the facts and the resources to help change minds. But if it doesn't, that doesn't mean I'm going to stop having those conversations or bringing up the truth and the realities of what is, right? In the chat, we had a really good question from someone. Ron Kelly wants to know, who inspired you to be an author?
I can answer this one. So first, anyway. So the first person that comes to mind is my fourth grade teacher. She gave us all a journal assignment, and it was I think it may have been one of my, like, just write what you think of writing assignments in school. And it was supposed to be like a daily entry into like what was going on in our lives. And I lived in as a kid, and I was heavily bullied at school. So when she told us to write about what was really going on in our lives, I was like, you don't really want to hear about that, so I'm just going to make something up. So I just started creating characters and writing a made-up story in my head down on paper. And, you know, it was supposed to be a page, and I think I turned in like 6 or 7. And she came to me the next day and was like, you know, you didn't follow the instructions, but I really enjoyed reading this. And, like, have you ever thought about doing this, like, as a profession? And that was the first time I learned, like, the books in the library didn't just appear. Someone had to write the stories. Someone had to think of them and write them. And that concept never the thought of being one just never crossed my mind. So that was, I think, the first seed that was planted. And then in the 5th grade, I entered a young authors competition. And that was the only thing that I have won first place in over the course of my entire life. Like that.
Wow.
And so that was another event that I was like, I could really do this. And then everyone who's ever, like, you know, given me a notebook for Christmas, and everyone who's ever read my stories as beta readers in high school, some of my friends did, all of those people had a hand in me being where I am today. And I have all of them to thank, because I would rather be doing nothing else.
That's pretty amazing. Yay for teachers and giving great assignments that inspire and spark. And also yay for, do you want to read something I wrote? Those people that say yes.
Yes.
Natalia?
Oh yeah. I actually, mine was also a teacher, which isn't surprising. I don't think. I feel like you can ask any author. Most of us do remember a teacher that I had. My teacher in ninth grade. I remember turning in an assignment, and afterwards she told me after class, and she just said, "Never, never stop writing." And it was really that simple. It was pretty amazing.
I'm reading a book right now, Fat Chance Charlie Vega, and her teacher is reading her stuff, and her teacher encourages her, your writing is really spectacular. You should enter it into a contest. So yay for teachers, a win for teachers. That's awesome. Another one of the questions along those lines is, what book did you like when you were in school that maybe inspired you to be a writer, a specific book or piece of writing?
I read Ella Enchanted by Gail Carson Levine and Dave at Night by Gail Carson Levine, and both of those books had such a huge impact on me. Ella Enchanted was the first book I read where the princess had a major hand in saving herself, and Dave at Night was the first book I read that featured a Black love interest. I had just never seen myself as a person to be desired in fairy tales and stories, and just seeing that, I was like, I want to make something like this. Why can't I make something like this? Both of those books were super influential on me.
That's awesome.
That's awesome.
I always think about Dreaming in Cuban by Christina Garcia, because it was really the first time I read it, and actually the first time I read it, I didn't read the whole thing because it was just my ninth grade teacher photocopied the first chapter, and she wanted us to read it during class. And that was my first time reading a Latinx author in all of my public school education in ninth grade. And this was Miami. But it was just, it's one of those moments where you're like, wait, like people like me write books, and there's like bits of Spanish in here. We can do that, and we can write like our own families. Like I had written stories my whole life thinking that I needed to write white characters because that's right. I feel like every time I speak to any author of color, we're always like, yeah, we did that. And it makes me so sad because what it really says is that we thought that's the only way to write a real book, right? Like supposedly. So yeah, it was amazing to read that. And then when I was in college, I saw that Christina Garcia was coming to Miami to teach a workshop. And so I remembered her name and I read the book. And at the time I was a poetry major. And by the time I finished reading it, I thought, no, this is what I want to do. Like, I never want to let go of these characters, and I want to be able to do that with books.
So just in case there's any teachers in watching, yay for teachers for encouraging great activities like that encourage and inspire writers. But also teachers, let's diversify our curriculum and add some people of color, Latinx, Indigenous writers and authors and works in our curriculum so that our students can see themselves, get inspired that they too can be writers as well, and share some of their stories as well. So let's talk about, again, our younger self. What advice would you give your younger self?
For me, I'd have to tell my younger self that it does get better. Because my childhood was rough. And just becoming an author seemed like a long ways away. Yeah, I'd probably just want to give myself a big old hug. And just be like, we're gonna make it.
I think a lot of us would tell ourselves that, right? It gets better. I feel like my kids are having a great childhood. And then we can talk and I'm like, oh wow, that was tough. Okay. And then I tell them it gets better, I promise.
Yeah.
Natalia, what would you tell your younger self? Either in Peru, in Florida, in Miami?
I think I love it gets better, first of all, because I think that encompasses so much. I think one of the things I struggled with a lot when I was younger was just being afraid to use my voice. And I think that's why I related so much to Maddie, because, when I talk about her being afraid to even raise her hand in class and how she feels her palms get really sweaty and she just feels like her voice is stuck inside of her. Like, that was me. And then yet I don't know that I could have predicted that, me, like however many years from, 20 years later after being a teenager, I'd be speaking at festivals and presenting my book and actually being okay with it. Aside from a few like rambling kind of nervous things that I do, but really it's okay, and that you really don't have to be afraid to use your voice. And that in some ways, I think the reason, even if I'm nervous, I'm more afraid of not saying anything. That really in the end, I think what can be worse is having the regret of staying silent than the fear than letting the fear keep you quiet.
So I'm gonna admit something that I'm proud to admit, that when I meet authors, after talking with authors, first of all, you automatically become my best friend. So whether you know that or not, you are now my best friend. And then I feel after speaking to them or even seeing them in the audience, I think, I can do this. I can write that novel I've been wanting to write. I'm going to go home and I'm going to write that border town Chicanita novel that and then I get so inspired and empowered and I want to do it. And then of course I sit in front of the desktop, the blinking screen and cursor, and it's all over. So I'm asking you, what can you share that's either the hardest or the easiest for you when writing, or the hardest and easiest for you when writing this particular story that you wrote?
The easiest part of writing for me is actually the drafting part. I'm a fast drafter, so I'll sit down and crank out a book in like 2 months. The editing. Writing feels to me a lot like taking a magic wand out into the woods and running free with it and just making whatever magic I want. And then editing looks like going back with a mop and a bucket and cleaning it up. And I'm like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to look at it again. I already made this cool thing. Why do I get? But it's a necessary part of writing. Like if I had left Slay the way it was when I first drafted it, I drafted Slay in 11 days. If I had left it that way, it would have been not nearly the book that it is now. Yeah, that's just, for me, editing has always been the toughest part, especially with a book like The Cost of Knowing. I was editing it while I was a boy, and so I now had to put myself in the shoes of my child, who will be able to relate to this main character in some ways, and this character goes through a lot, so it took a lot out of me emotionally.
And I think people either tend to forget or don't realize, or they don't know that editing is part of the process. And especially our young students, when I have a writing, before pandemic, had a writing club, and then I also co-teach a writing class with a teacher on my campus. The editing, they're like what you just said, why do I have to do that? If this was perfect the first time, I don't get it. And I always chuckle. I'm like, oh, you're so cute. Here's your paper again. So yeah, I think they forget that part, right? And the fact that you just said it's so important. We would have a story right now with a toothpaste checker.
Yes, you would.
Natalia, what's the easiest and hardest for you in this story?
Opposite, Brittney. I'm the exact, I'm just like flipped. For me, the hardest part is the first draft, the drafting, the blank page. I'm just like, I don't know if it's my perfectionist tendencies or if it's actually, no, I think that sometimes too often we think of perfectionism and it's really just anxiety over any little thing being wrong. Yeah, right? And
that part.
Yeah, I'm realizing it, because like so much of anxiety is just, and I know you've touched on this too, is just like the whole unknown future and fixating on that. And for me, it's like, well, what if I don't get it right on the page? And I think there's something about like once the draft is done, at least that fear, I'm like, oh yeah, no, that's horrible, but I'm still here and now I can fix it, And so editing for me is actually where it starts to feel a little more freeing, because it's like no matter what I do, I mean, I could rewrite the whole book, but there will still be a book. Versus when I'm in rough draft mode, I do not yet have a book. So yeah.
Yeah, and as a person who has never written a novel, yes, I think that's probably a hard part, which is why I have never written a novel. So there you go. So really quick question, do you prefer pen and paper, old school, or device?
Pretty much the whole time I'm writing a first draft, and a lot of while I'm editing, I'll have my book on the left side of the screen and then a video let's play going on the right side of the screen. So I'll be watching somebody play through a video game while I'm drafting, and that just helps me, like, it helps my brain bounce back and forth, and jumping out of the book so often actually helps me to like reframe it every 30 seconds or so. I don't know why that works for me, but I feel like if I was using pen and paper, I would just be super distracted by everything I need to clean in the house and just talking to people. I don't know. With my laptop, I can focus a little more.
That's interesting.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's very interesting.
I'm like a mixture. I'll say I'll write like 95% of my books on the computer, but like for example with running, and even no, not everyone knows. With running, the first pages I wrote of the book were in my journal, and it was really just that I woke up one morning and I was like, oh, I think I finally can hear her voice. Because sometimes before I even start to write, I'll just be thinking about a book for like, it could be weeks or months, and it's just like simmering there and marinating, and what I do sometimes is if I'm stuck, I will switch back to longhand and see if that helps me. So I have random passages of a draft in my journals, and then in putting them into the draft, I start editing again, and it just kind of helps me get back into a draft.
Okay, note to writers, make sure you get yourself a notebook and a really good pen. Tracy Shelton had the same question. We just answered longhand or computer, but she also wants to know, do you start with an outline?
I do. I give myself 24 hours to outline once I have a basic concept in my head. And that 24 hours can be spread over time. So I can do 6 hours one day, 4 hours the next day, but I cap it at 24. I've tried before not limiting that, and I'll just outline for weeks and weeks and weeks. And then the story will get so big that I'll get to a point where I'm like, why did I start this in the beginning? This is, I'm not even saying what I wanted to say in the beginning anymore, and then throw the whole story out the window. So I cap it at 24 hours, but I do always start with an outline that's like a page and a half long.
And then you have Game of Thrones.
Not quite. I think if I was writing a fantasy, I would need like way longer and way more pages to outline. But since I write contemporary, it can be a little more trim in the outline stage.
I feel like outline that would you have if it's hard to write the story to begin with, now you have to come up with an outline too. Natalia, do you outline?
Yes, but it's like a hybrid. Like I usually start out just writing. And I'll say like maybe a quarter of the way in, I'll then pause and outline, because I kind of want to know my characters first. And it's I would equate it to like getting in a car and going, and at first being like excited that you're going on a trip. And then eventually you've gone far enough and you're like, okay, now I want to know where I'm going, right? So it's like I need some direction, but initially the spark is what kind of carries me. And I try to think about, because I always, I don't know that I could write an outline from the beginning. I could try it. I probably should. I've just never done it. I always just kind of go, like I said. And then the outline always changes, but it's good to have it, just so I don't meander too much.
For me, my synopsis always changes. I'm always like staring there at a blank page, having to write the synopsis. Like, I have no idea what happens. I haven't written the book yet.
That's funny. Well, because I'm a librarian, really quick, because we're almost out of time, just tell me really quick, what are you currently reading or you're currently excited to read this year?
I just finished reading Concrete Rose by Angie Thomas. It's incredible. Everybody should go read it. I am now reading Joy at Work by Marie Kondo because I'm setting up a new desk and I want organization inspiration. But I'm really excited to read Ace of Spades, which comes out in June.
Very cool. I'm about to start reading What's Mine and Yours by Naima Coster. And I'm also really excited to read, I guess, a book that's coming out later this year, but it's called Simone Breaks All the Rules by Debbie Rigo. And also Mercy Suarez Can't Dance by Meg Medina, which is like a sequel to Mercy Suarez Switches Gears, which I loved. So yeah, there's just so many great books.
No. So what's mine and yours by Naima? My daughter's name is Naima. So
Oh, cool.
um, when I just saw the cover of the book and I saw the author, I was like, I've got to read that book. I don't even know what it's about. So I've got to read that book. Okay, so we have about 5 minutes before we go. Do you want to share your projects that are soon to come out or coming out in the future? Maybe a little excerpt or something?
Yeah. My next book is called The Jump. It's another YA contemporary. It comes out in 2023. It is about 4 Seattle teens who run a cryptology forum, and they take on a cryptology puzzle posted by a mysterious group called The Order that promises the winners influence, political influence, and is planned to use to take down an oil refinery that's going up in their neighborhood. So my goal with this book is to make the most action-packed book I've ever written, and I'm already having a ton of fun with it. I think I'm on chapter 4 as of yesterday, so really excited to share that with everyone.
That's awesome. My book also comes out in 2022. It's my next YA book as well, and it's about a Peruvian American teenager living in Central Florida who has hip dysplasia, which is a condition that I was born with, and she's auditioning to become a mermaid at a Central Florida theme park, all in a summer in which she's also navigating falling in love and kind of going against her parents' wishes because they want her to have this very, like, it's not exactly an immigrant parent's dream for the daughter to become a mermaid. That's not their idea of the American dream, I guess. So she's navigating all these things and, you know, and also navigating how she feels in terms of the alignment of like being in a world that maybe hasn't fully imagined you in it. As a disabled person.
I love that that's what your next project is. Just like The Cost of Knowing, Black Boy Joy, it reminded me a lot of We Need Diverse Lit, right? And so we think, oh, I need to get all the books on slavery and all the books on the immigration issue. But we also need to think about showing that joy and that just regular life and just a little Chicana girl living on the border falling in love. That's normal too. I have family that have had to struggle with immigration, but that's not my story. And so I love that you guys are sharing and writing stories like that so our kids can see it's not all about the struggle. There's also joy in life, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, one more question. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think that even when there is struggle, it doesn't mean that it erases the joy. And I think that's something that's just I think so often people who are marginalized get seen through the lens only of what is their perceived suffering. And then I think that if we're only doing that, we're already dehumanizing them, right? And if anything, I don't know that I could write a whole book and sustain it if I didn't have joy at its center.
Oh, that's pretty awesome. One more question then. Sometimes our emotions and mindsets can take a deep dive into the cynical, frustrated and sometimes that's necessary, sometimes it's cathartic, but what would you suggest to get out of that state? What do you do that helps?
That's a tough question because I feel like I'm a pretty cynical person. But I mean, for me, it's just as simple as, doing things that make me happy. Yoga, travel, going for a walk, enjoying my husband and my baby, reminding myself constantly what makes me go on and why I do what I do and what makes me smile. It can be, as simple as that to just take the edge off sometimes. Life is hard. I feel like I couldn't write the books that I write if I didn't do that.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think so much of it is reminding yourself, like even when we are writing the hard things, I think it comes out of a place of love and protection. And that's something that's beautiful. That's something worth sustaining and fighting for.
Absolutely. And keep reading, especially hopeful books that show the joy as well, especially these 2 books of 2 amazing, several teens in these stories that are doing things in life that you guys are going through as well, and that you can learn from them as well and their stories as well. So if you haven't already read these books, go out to your library, get them at the Nowhere bookstore, and make sure you read them now. And of course, read their future stories that Brittney and Natalia are coming out with. Thank you so much, guys, for spending some time with me and letting me ramble and fangirl over you guys. Thank you for coming, and thank you for thinking of our teams when you're writing.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.